Cloud. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cerium Journal Club for June 2024. We're going to discuss a paper on cardiovascular events and cannabis use. And here to kick it off is the CEO of Physicians Research Center, Teresa Simon. And just remember that I control the slides, so Dr. Kamen and Dr. Malloy and Teresa, just feel free to say, please go forward or please go backward.
All right, so you want to go forward to the next slide? All right, perfect. So good evening and welcome to Physicians Research Center's Cerium Journal Club. You'll see that we have three branches to Physicians Research Center. We're going to focus on Cerium this evening. It's our education program designed for the busy healthcare provider who wants to understand cannabis and its derivatives through the lens of science. It's all rooted in science. And you can check out our website if you want to learn more at prctrials-plus.com. What's your next slide, Jahan? Excellent. So here we have a questionnaire that we'd like you to participate in. If you want to scan the QR code, and you can respond later or right now, you can do it. It's about 20 to 30 questions around for the healthcare provider. So it'd be awesome if you could complete that.
We will show the QR code at the end as well.
Okay, great. Tonight we're going to be talking, as Jahan said, we're talking about cannabis use with cardiovascular outcomes. And joining us is Dr. Len Kamen from Jefferson University. We also have Dr. Phil Malloy, who's a rheumatologist in Massachusetts, and Dr. Jahan Marcoux, molecular pharmacologist and cannabinoid researcher. So, Jahan, I think you're going to kick it off, right?
Yes, thank you, Teresa. So today we're going to discuss a paper entitled Association of Cannabis Use with Cardiovascular Outcomes Among U.S. Adults. And this is a very large survey type of study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. We'll get into that in a little bit, but first I want to have some fun with a poll question. If you're able to participate, let me just find my Zoom window. Don't worry, I know where it is. Pull up these poll questions. There we go. All right, so just one question. It should pop up on your screen now. Have you had a personal experience or heard a story about a cardiovascular side effect from cannabis use? We have, and so for example, I've heard stories about people who play sports and use these products. I've heard all sorts of stories from mild to exhilarating to intense to not great. We'll keep it open for just another second or two for people to respond. And we've got everyone in, so we'll end the poll and share results. So interestingly, we have, over 60% of attendees have heard of an event for better or worse. I've heard one, and 33% have not heard of a cardiovascular event. So I think you'll find this paper very interesting today. Yeah, more than half of our attendees have either had a personal experience or heard a story, perhaps from a patient, about a cardiovascular side effect. Thank you. All right. So we're going to jump into the paper real quick and just kind of share how the paper kind of outlined this issue. So this up on the right is just a little graphic that goes through some of the media coverage, the headlines that Dr. Malloy had gathered while we were preparing this. And there was a lot of media coverage. And Dr. Malloy, feel free to jump in here if I missed something, right? So we know that cannabis can have an effect on heart rate. We know that people have reported elevated blood pressure as well as hypotension. We know that there's confounding factors like lifestyle, diet, exercise, other substance use, caffeine use, tobacco use, and that we have vulnerable populations, right? There's people with diabetes, there's people who are obese. The paper also points out that in the adult population, cannabis use is increasing. And we also have a population of adults that are obese in this country. It's also an issue. And currently, there's a burden with cardiovascular disease in this country that's over $350 billion. And so we kind of have this perfect storm. We already have a disease burden in this country that's significant. We have a big vulnerable population for cardiovascular issues, and we have this factor known as cannabis use that could be contributing to this issue. Dr. Malloy, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before I move on to the next slide.
It was stunning all the how many times this article was quoted in all the news feeds that we all get all the time. Made a big splash 6 months ago.
Excellent. Yeah, I was surprised too when you sent me like 6 articles that cover this.
Yeah.
And what I think one of the reasons why this study was so popular was because it used this CDC database, this government database known as the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And they took data from 27 states as well as 2 territories with over 400,000 people. And so this is a database for general health behavior, and they include cannabis questions in this database. And this had a wide population, 18 to 74 years. So I thought this was pretty significant in terms of survey data. This wasn't 10 people that they interviewed at the mall. This was a population that they've been tracking for a while and send surveys to regularly and contribute to that database. And so for the purposes of this study, cannabis use was defined largely as smoking cannabis. So when we talk about it for the purposes of this study and just kind of staying focused on these results, they just looked at smoking. That was their big thing. So this isn't necessarily able to directly translate to edibles, for example, because we don't know details about the product. We actually don't know if it's illicit versus regulated. If someone got a product from someone else and used it and then reported in the survey that they had a cardiovascular event, we don't really know the origin of the product. And I think that's an important consideration considering all the different isomers and product forms there are out there. Just so that we can't say that this is associated with state licensed operations, and we can't say it's associated with illicit cannabis. It's all over. Dr. Malloy,
We also can't say if it's. We don't know how much THC content. We don't know if it was adulterated with anything else, the purity. So we don't really know any product details. It's self-reported. I used cannabis. That's all it says. Yeah.
Yep. But what is amazing is all the information and associations they were able to glean. So while we were working on this, I put together all of the significant associations, that is, had statistical support. And some of the ones that jumped out at me were 2 of like for example, in this study, again, the daily cannabis users tended to be younger on average. Non-cannabis users were older on average. A lower proportion of the women were daily cannabis users. I thought many of these findings were interesting. Dr. Malloy, was there anything that stood out from you with this
It's almost,
table
if you
1?
go, down to the middle, and cannabis users have a lower proportion, less diabetes, and less sedentary. So it's almost, you wonder if they are self-selecting. I'm a high-risk cardiovascular patient, so I'm not going to be a daily user. Obviously, it's not a randomized study; it's observational population study. But you wonder what led to diabetics avoiding being daily users, for example.
It's a
So,
great question, and I think that there are other factors that daily cannabis users had a significantly higher proportion of daily alcohol users, and I think that
and the
that
second
also
to
is
last,
interesting.
the second to last bullet, people with
Yes.
established coronary heart disease were less likely to be daily users. So you just wonder how that came
Right.
to be.
And maybe that's
That's
self-selecting. People who are more active
yeah,
may not, uh, you know, if they may not be
right,
as much of a risk to
right,
the effects of daily cannabis use.
right.
All right.
But they did not it didn't point out other comorbidities here. So again, one of the strongest indications for cannabis, at least through um, the studies, the national science studies, were spasticity, for instance. So how many of these patients already had a spastic condition that they were treating themselves with, MS, cerebral palsy, stroke, spinal cord injuries. It did not cover comorbidities other than tobacco, other substance abuse issues, and the cardiovascular profile that is listed. So
That
it's missing some critical pieces.
Yeah, I think that's
So
a great point because they did ask people, has a doctor ever told you that you have a cardiovascular issue? And they did not, I don't think, pull the data or ask the questions about do you have a pre-existing condition such as a spasticity disorder? I think that's a great point. Sorry, Dr. Malloy, you were going to.
no, if they did, they didn't report it. I'm not sure if it's in the database, but it's not reported in this paper.
All right.
What you're
Well, let's
asking
see.
for, Len. Yeah.
And here they do talk about some of the other factors here with the table two, which is the association between daily use and other variants. And so I don't know if Teresa, if you're still with us, this paper talks about odds ratios,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I
So
have
I
seen,
would like to go back to table one. Am I still muted?
no,
No.
you're
Okay.
unmuted.
I'd like to go back to table one, because uh, the table one items that you have listed here, these are percentages of the population. And under daily cannabis use versus non-daily cannabis use versus no cannabis use. Just look at, I mean, the distribution, the distribution of, the proportion of people like by age, you have overall, 30% are 18 to 34-year-olds, and then the daily cannabis users, it's higher, and the 65 plus, it's much lower, right? And then when you go and look at education, the same, start to see some differences between, same with smoking. So even at the baseline characteristics, I would say that there is, you were talking about self-selection, Bill. I mean, even at the baseline characteristics, you can see those trends, right?
And we had a great comment from Cannabis Nurse Wendy. Thank you so much. I want to read this real quick. Um, uh, where did it go? It's here somewhere. She says the assumption is that cannabis use was established before the CV event, rather than acknowledging that some people may have used it post-stroke to deal with pain and muscle spasms. So we might have a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing here, where we don't, maybe the authors, we don't have an exact timeline of which came first, the cardiovascular issue or the cannabis use. And maybe back to your point, Dr. Malloy, like the self-selection, maybe they got the news that they had a CV issue and they stopped being a daily user, or vice versa. We could
Right.
have,
And it's survey data. So it's cross-sectional. So you just have a
Yeah,
point in
exactly.
time. So it's not a longitudinal cohort study where you're following them, but you're watching their exposure and you're monitoring their outcomes, which is what
Right.
I think everybody looks at this stuff and they immediately think cohort study, but these are not cohort studies.
yeah.
Right.
So great comment. Thank you. Thank you, Nurse Wendy. Really appreciate it. Fantastic. So just a reminder to everyone else, feel free to throw in your questions and comments to the group, and we will open it up for discussion towards the end. We just want to get everyone calibrated on the data before we open it up. So Teresa, you're a pharmacoepidemiologist. Most of the time when I see statistics, I go back to biostats in grad school, and I start to have a cardiovascular event. So can you tell me a little bit about these odds ratios? Like I see 0.6, I see with diabetes it's a 2.4, I see a former smoker, tobacco smoker is 1.73 in that left-hand column under CHD, which is coronary heart disease. Are those numbers big? Are they small? Is a small number better? Is a big number worse? What can you tell us?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. So yeah, so I think that what this is odds ratios are similar to relative risks in that you're quantifying the risk, the associated risk with an outcome. And so what you have here, and when you look at this data, it's like, okay, the association between heart disease and diabetes is 2.4. This is the population of those who had the surveillance. So we already know that that's an existing association. I maybe would have expected it to be higher, but we don't know. To Dr. Kamen and Dr. Malloy's points, we don't really have a solid history. We have a point in time. And so this says that people with diabetes have a doubling of risk to have heart disease. And when they're and you don't say protective, but we do say protective, is that when it's less than 1, and I would question this outcome as well, right? So the races, I mean, we always have known, and I'm going to look to the physicians about this, that different races have an increased risk of some of these outcomes.
Well, black race is protected, I mean, in some of this, but another way of saying, if you look at stroke, if you put your arrow on stroke on the first row, it's 1.42. So it's not double. Yeah, one up to the first entry on that column,
All right.
Yeah.
1.42. So cannabis use, it means that, this is how I read it, that in patients who are similar in all ways except cannabis use, their odds ratio is 1.42. They are 42% more likely to have a stroke
That's correct. That's
than
correct.
non-cannabis users that are otherwise matched. So that's, and whether you think that's clinically relevant or not, by the way, it's the exact same number that NSAIDs increase the risk of MACE, cardiovascular adverse events caused by, it's actually 1.42, it means 42% higher. So it's not about the absolute risk. It could be still remote, but it's 42% higher. It could be
Right.
tiny, but it's 42%
And,
more.
Right.
and
And they
so
have
is
non-daily and daily alcohol use is protected.
Right. Which I
well,
was
we
very
again we
happy.
don't have similar to cannabis. We don't know the amounts. Maybe all of
Right.
these people drink one glass of really good red wine and they get those polyphenols, right? There's that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
know. Well, this is maybe these are not whiskey drinkers that drink,
Yeah.
a pint of whiskey a day.
Yeah.
We don't know. But I think that's a good question because we hear these stories about, a
Yeah.
glass of wine being
Yeah.
healthy. But with current smoker here, I want to understand that tobacco smoking, we see this 2.08. That's a 108% increased odds or risk.
Yes.
We call it a doubling, and it's statistically
Yeah.
significant. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
We usually say a doubling because it's a 2 or greater.
So
And that's compared to subjects that are similar in all other risk factors that they fished for, except smoking. If you
Yeah. So
just
they
isolate,
adjusted
that's
it
what
for,
this
they
that's what
adjusted it all at the
multi-regression
bottom
stuff
here.
means. Yeah.
Yep.
Which one of the strengths of this study is it accounts for all of the risk factors. So these numbers are in patients who are the same, and the only difference compared uh, to come up with these numbers are patients who have a similar profile except for this risk factor.
excellent. And I think, some of this stuff makes sense too. Regular physical activity is associated with a decreased risk. So some of this data makes sense as
Right.
well. All
Okay.
right, we'll move on to the next slide. Or Len, Dr.
Yeah.
Kamen?
Just the Hispanic ethnicity doesn't really make sense to me.
What do
Why
you
is it-
mean?
Look, well, I suspect a higher use. Maybe I'm wrong. It's an assumption. Does that is that in sync with other data about ethnicity between the Black race and the Hispanic race? I just don't. I see that as a skew. I don't know if that is
So that's my point, is that I don't believe that that's consistent with what we know, right? I thought that Blacks were at higher risk of certain cardiovascular diseases, especially MI. So, but,
But if
and
you
heart disease,
if you correct for smoking, obesity, um, and all, and diabetes and all that, maybe it doesn't hold for race
right. Yep,
independent
yep,
of
because you're
the whole
adjusting.
package.
It's
Yeah,
true. You're
Yeah.
adjusting for all those other
yeah.
confounders. Yep.
Maybe blacks have more obesity, more smoking, more height, other risk factors.
Okay. In this population. Um,
Yes.
all
Yeah.
right. So we'll
Okay.
move on
And
to
you
the
already
next.
are skewed because not everybody completes surveys. So you already have
Yeah.
a data just
Yeah.
like out of the gate.
So even though we are still scratching our heads at some of the odds ratio data, some of it makes sense and we can kind of rationalize it, and some of it we may want to do more homework and see if it's in line with what other studies have found. So I think that that's a great thing we can come back to. Um, but uh, Dr. Malloy, we had discussed this figure as one of the best figures you could hope for in a paper like this. This is probably one of the best pieces of evidence, and this is, for lack of a better term, a dose-response relationship, looking at reported exposure and outcomes. And I think that this again starts to show these trends where more frequent cannabis use is associated with higher odds of certain outcomes. Myocardial infarction and stroke, but not coronary heart disease. So I thought this was a good figure. Dr. Molloy, do you want to comment?
In general, seeing a dose response curve adds credibility to the data and conclusions. If a certain dose is bad for you, twice as much is worse for you. It makes it more credible.
And and we don't know the potency and necessarily how many times per day people were using it. And this is self-reported exposure. But if they're reporting it, they have to remember it. So it must have been memorable amount that was used.
Right.
And,
Good.
and I think that's, again, this is for, again, the association is, when we think about it, is daily use is really the concern here. As we've
Right.
talked about non-daily use, and I think from these figures, and again, I'll look to Dr. Kamen and Dr. Malloy to help correct my PhD thinking here, but again, just conceptually, if you're using every day, you have more risk than someone who's using every 3 days, than someone who's using once a week. And we're talking
Right.
about smoking, inhaling
Yeah.
particulate matter, which we already know is not great.
Right.
All right. We will move on. Happy to come back to this figure later. We
Right.
do have one other figure that looked at some other socio-demographic factors, health-related behaviors, and comorbidities. And so what this table 3 showed, and we pulled these trends out, is that what I found was interesting was that you had younger individuals and men are more likely to be daily cannabis users. Older individuals and women are more likely to be non-cannabis users, or so says the population that they looked at. And we have to remember that the non-cannabis use was a order of magnitude larger population than anything they looked at. They had over 200,000 people, 240,000 individuals responding to surveys, where in daily cannabis use for this, for example, they had 2,800. So again, there's a huge difference in the number of people, and even in non-daily cannabis use was around 8,800. So 240,000, 8,000, 2,000. Those are really big pools. But the trends that are emerging are interesting. But it'd be interesting if the daily cannabis use pool was bigger. Would we see some of those trends sort of balance out or not? But potentially there are clinical interventions there. Young males seem to be using cannabis daily, according to this survey. Higher education levels are more common in non-cannabis users and daily cannabis users tend to have lower education levels. We do see substance use patterns of daily use associated with alcohol use. What I found was interesting was a health and physical activity. While daily use does seem to have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and stroke, but lower rates of coronary heart disease and infarction, they also had higher physical activity levels. So I think that to me is an interesting finding from this survey that they were able to tease out. But these, again, are just some of the trends and significant differences that the authors pointed to. I'll pause for comments from the good doctors, if we have any for the moment.
I just find the variables in the health and physical activity to, again, be somewhat against the grain. You would think that those, obesity, diabetes, and stroke, how could they have lower rates of heart disease? I don't understand that. It doesn't make clinical sense to me. The daily cannabis uses, but lower rates of, so they have all these high risk factors, but lower coronary heart disease. It doesn't make sense. And lower myocardial to non. I guess it's just what comes out. But it goes to show you, to me, that there's so many other variables, genetics, the epigenetics of these diseases, and how they create a susceptibility to these different conditions are so variable, and so many other lifestyle factors, socioeconomic factors, and perhaps other medical factors that are not calculated here. And it is what it is. But that's what I read.
Dr. Kamen, are you familiar with the skinny hippie theory?
Yeah.
About how, do you think that might play into why we don't see the coronary heart disease issue? Is maybe that many users, that there's a population that doesn't have a high BMI, something like that, maybe? Or
Well, I was a hippie, so
I think we have to read the sentence very carefully. Daily cannabis users have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and stroke. But daily cannabis users have lower rates of coronary artery disease, MIs. It's not saying that patients with obesity and diabetes have lower rates. It's daily users. I think it's easy to make to tie the wrong subject with the wrong verb on that sentence if you're not careful.
okay.
Is that verbatim from the paper?
No, that's me trying to distill out little droplets of knowledge from these tables that are digestible.
Do they
We do
address
have
that
a
in the
quote.
discussion? I have to remember if they do.
Yeah, we do have a quote from the paper,
Yep.
from the conclusions coming up.
As usual, we look for a really good quote from the authors from the paper, because why say what we think when we can just quote other people? But the authors state that past 30-day cannabis use was associated with MI, stroke, and composite outcomes of CHD, MI, and stroke among adults 18 to 74 years old, controlling for tobacco smoking status, age, sex, race and ethnicity, body mass index, diabetes, alcohol use, educational attainment, and physical activity. This effect exhibited a dose-response relationship. Did that answer your question, Teresa?
Yes, thank you.
It's an important conclusion, too.
And so, just to
Does anyone
summarize,
Yeah, we have to open it for questions in a minute. I was going to ask the audience if they had any thoughts about that quote,
Well,
but go
get
ahead.
them, yeah,
Yep.
participants, get them cooking. We're rounding the bend here. As you can see, that street was supposed to indicate we're near the end of the road with this. Um, but just to summarize the article, and then we just have one or two other stops along the way, and we'll discuss some of the clinical takeaways from this. But again, just pulling out some of the factoids that the authors presented was that 4% of respondents reported daily use, while 7.1% reported non-daily use. That is a small percentage of this huge population. So again, in the non-user category, I think they had better resolution and resolving power for statistics compared to some of these groups. They still had thousands of respondents, which is great. They report a 25% increased risk of myocardial infarction with daily cannabis use. They report 42% higher risk of stroke associated with daily use. And again, combined risk was 28% higher among daily users. Among never tobacco smokers, daily cannabis use was also significantly associated with these risks. So independent, I think that's an important finding for the daily cannabis user to keep in mind, is that if they are getting a health benefit from cannabis, they may be negating it with daily use. So that is a factor to consider. Clearly in the study, not everyone who is a daily user had this issue, but again, it is a risk factor. And I think that's an important thing to consider with, again, how they define cannabis use is smoking. So as we near the end here, I think it's important to remember when we look at basic research, there are potential health benefits and risks. As a basic researcher, I have worked on these models when I was at Temple University. You can induce an ischemic event in an animal model. You can prevent brain damage from that using cannabinoids. You can protect cardiomyocytes, I think, from damage with an insult in a petri dish. You can also stress a cardiovascular system in an animal as well with some of these compounds and strongly stimulating the endocannabinoid system. Individual experiences vary widely. Some people may never notice it, and some people, for example, I was at a meeting yesterday and had someone say, oh, their friend was golfing and hadn't used cannabis in 20 years, and they took a couple inhalations off a joint, and they thought their heart was going to jump out of their chest, and they had to go home, and they sought medical advice after that because they had a cardiovascular event. It was non-life threatening to my knowledge, but again, it's, I hear these stories, you read these news articles, and people are experiencing things, again, from mild to intense. And it's important to keep in mind that this study, while I think the point of talking about this is to talk about its strengths and weaknesses, it had a lot of strength. Its size, some of the things we see in our daily life, some of those risk factors we saw there. Here, there are a couple, I think, caveats or weaker points as well that we pointed out. And I'm happy to come back to any slides if anyone has comments. Just letting you know, this is a very active area of research. There's tons of research looking at the effects of cannabinoids for or against cardiovascular health. There's a wide variety of research there. So I just want to pause here, talk about clinical notes, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Kamen, some of your takeaways from this, and then let's start to open up for questions. You can raise your hand if you're Zoom savvy and you know how to do that, or unmute yourself and use proper Zoom room etiquette. All right. I don't know, Dr. Len Kamen, I want to give you guys a first round if you have any clinical comments,
Well, I
about
struggle.
this.
Yeah, I struggle with how to take articles like this and bring it into the exam room, one patient at a time. I don't know who to focus on. I don't know whom cannabis users are and not cannabis users are in my office. I do know their cardiovascular risk profiles, but there's a lot of roadblocks in effecting good discussions with patients on this and other issues related to cannabis, really.
Thank you, Dr.
I
Kamen.
agree. Yeah, I agree, Phil, that it's, I mean, thinking about, tobacco, every package of tobacco says on it, it's going to kill you. It's going to maim you. It's going to make you sick. Doesn't have, it doesn't seem to affect the diehard smokers, I guess. The frequency has dropped. I do have a question. I thought the general use population exposure of cannabinoids was in the realm of 20% in the population. And if you combine the daily users here and the non-daily users, it was only 10% of that 5,000 population. So are they missing something there? I do think that that individual individual effects, as you mentioned, individual have different effects, and I think I would be disparaging of the skinny hippie theory. I saw many obese and not skinny hippies, believe me, who smoke pot, by the way. But so I don't know that I go along with that skinny hippie theory. But in general, I find the results of this to be useful, to be awareness of the risk. I don't know exactly how to communicate it, but I do think that we have to heed the overall picture here. And it would be something I would incorporate in my discussions with people seeking medical marijuana in my office.
The
I was just going
yeah,
to say we had a comment from Sanford. Hello, Sanford. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining. He said 20%, is that only
Yeah,
included
so
smokers, not edible users? Yeah, so that did include, the study was only looking at cannabis smoking.
so so the
But hold on,
question, yeah,
let
yeah.
me, Nurse Wendy has had her hand open up for a while. Let me go to her and we can come back to your specific question, Sanford. But Nurse Wendy, you've been waiting patiently with your hand open. I want to make sure you get a chance to ask your question or your comment about the paper.
Great, thank you for going over this article, this study, because I really need to understand it better. I was wondering if we have other studies that show lower rates of diabetes and obesity to draw from too.
For in terms of in the cannabis population?
Yes.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I think it would depend where you ask that question. I think if you asked, in an urban area versus a rural area, you might get maybe different demographics on that. And that's why we talked about the skinny hippie theory, is there a lower, is there a trend towards people being skinnier who use cannabis? And we don't think that might be. Maybe it was true at one point with the data, but it's not true anymore. It was not borne out in longitudinal research, I don't think.
I thought maybe the studies of athletes and the professional athletes who are using cannabis in training and for recovery might bear some of that information.
That is a good question. I will look into it. I don't know if I have an answer off the top of my head. Let me see if I can, if anything comes to mind before the end of the session, I'll let you know. I don't know, Dr. Kamen or Malloy, if you're familiar with that.
I'm not. It's a population with less obesity and younger and less these athletes and less cardiovascular risk factors in general, I would assume.
Thanks. Can I get your contact information for one of our physicians who is being attacked on this?
So do we want to put we could put the PRC contact information to connect you Yeah,
That'd be great.
Teresa, can you put the PRC email in the chat for Nurse
Yeah,
Wendy?
I can do that for everyone. Yeah.
All right, and Sanford, thank you for putting the comment in the chat. Did you have a comment or question about the
Yeah, yeah,
paper?
yeah. So first of all, thank you very much, everyone. John, I'm just a PhD and not an epidemiologist. However, one of my closest friends is one of the top cardiologists in the world. I'll leave his name. And he was involved with, I'm actually someone mentioned, I think, a very adroit comment at the beginning, is that it was not a longitudinal study. So I'm posting right here this paper that was in the American Journal of Public Health in 2017. This is from Northwestern University here in Chicago. And they came to the conclusion somewhat different than this paper. And so if you're not familiar with this, you might want to look at it as a counterpoint to this study. So that's just number one, fact. Number two is on a personal level. I can tell you from my personal experience, when I go in to see a cardiologist at my age, I'm almost 75, and I say that I use medical marijuana, they start talking about these kind of these papers, like this one was just published, and they hear, they read a little bit about it, and they get all bent out of shape, and they won't talk to you, and they think you're killing yourself, and that you're going to wind up with a cardiac event. And yet this paper is very clear that there's a dose response relationship. We're talking about daily cannabis users, and the problem is, I think that the situation is that the press, as we know, distorts and mischaracterizes all scientific papers, and even doctors, hear
Right.
this information and they react in a way that's not very helpful. And anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
So yeah, I think I've seen this paper too before. I think this paper, what we discussed today, might actually be in more agreement than we may appreciate at the moment, because this paper also showed there was not, with coronary heart disease, there was not necessarily an increased risk. It really was talking about stroke and myocardial infarction.
Right.
But again, this
Yeah.
is just in the population that responds to CDC surveys. So I'm
Right.
not sure what sort of self-selection
Yeah.
there might be in
Right.
that.
I mean, to your
Um,
point, this paper here that you were discussing is a very, very large group of people, 200,000. And so every paper has its strengths and weaknesses. And, it's the best you can do.
Hey,
Absolutely.
Sanford, can I ask you a question? If you hadn't have volunteered that information, do you think your cardiologist would have queried you about it?
Well, it's in my medical record.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I think it's a good question, because that's something we've talked about before on this journal club, is that clinicians need to be more willing to have these discussions, and more willing to discuss the research, because the media does distort, I think, and try to, I've talked to journalists, as I'm sure many of us have, who are covering stories, and they're like, they want qualitative information. They don't want quantitative information, and I think it does lend itself to a little bit of scientific abuse. But I think with these discussions, I think the hope is that more clinicians feel comfortable going on the offensive a little bit, and engaging in these discussions in a more proactive way, and be more willing to discuss these data sets in a more holistic way. And that's part of our goal. All right, so it is a few minutes after 8:45. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I just want to remind you that we do have, this is reoccurring meeting, same Zoom link until further notice. Every first Tuesday of every month, 8 p.m. Eastern, we're going to talk about an anxiety paper. I think the event's on LinkedIn, it's on the PRC webpage, it's on my personal webpage. There's lots of places to find more information about the paper. And then for August, September, and October, we are only going to focus on pregnancy and development. We're just going to, because it's such a big topic, also covered a lot in the media. There's been so much published about it. We're just going to do 3 different papers in that area. And please tell your friends and colleagues to come and join us. And again, we just talk about the paper and its data and try to break it down just like this. So appreciate everyone. And again, just want to let you know, if you are a clinician, we do have a survey. You can help us out scanning. Teresa put in the PRC email. If you want to grab that, shoot us email. We can also send you a link for this. But every journal club will be sharing the survey for you to participate in. But thank you, everyone, and thank you for your kind words. Oh, that's a great question. Teresa, since you're the epidemiologist running the survey, Nurse Wendy wanted to know, she's not a clinician, she's a healthcare practitioner, but should she?
All healthcare providers. When you fill it out, there should be a space that says whether you're a nurse practitioner, physician's assistant. So that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. Well,
and feedback is welcome on the questionnaire as well. We're always trying to improve it.
Excellent. All right. Well, I don't want to go too far into the weeds on some of the backup slides, but I just want to say bid you adieu and thank you so much for participating, especially for all your discussion from the healthcare practitioners. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Kamen, and Nurse Wendy. Appreciate it. And Teresa for giving us the platform to discuss these papers. All right.
Well, thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, guys.
All right. I bid you adieu.
Night, thanks, guys.